obviously great this past weekend. And I said it afterwards. There was a lot of things went on last week. Obviously, I thought distraction-wise, just coming off a bye week, homecoming, just things like that. That I think for me, I was as impressed with our guys as anything. Just the way they handled that whole situation, having a few extra days, obviously with the bye, and then all the other things that kind of homecoming throws upon us, and to go out and play. I thought that we played really well in all three phases of the game. There's things we can do a lot better. But I think more than anything, we were sound in what we were doing. We didn't make a whole lot of mistakes. We were pretty penalty-free in a lot of those things, which gave us a chance and an opportunity. Now, we have to continue to grow, and this is another great opportunity for us. Kind of those things that you kind of prepared for in fall camp, knowing that things were going to get a little bit different as you got into the stretch run of the Big Ten, meaning, those first few games defensively, you saw a lot of different things, meaning spread and air raids and stuff like that. And then as you get into the heart and soul of your league, you're going to see some things that are a little bit different. And that's what we're going to see today, this weekend. I told somebody this morning that I just in case you guys were wondering, I'm a traditionalist. So if you want to ask about rivalries are really, really, really important to me. And they always have been, just the way I grew up, obviously in a Big Ten country. Not that I've known a ton about, obviously, the rivalry. That's why I thought it was a big deal for us as a program and a staff to make sure that, this summer and even in fall camp that we, studied the rivalry and made sure we had nights about the rivalry, both this one and the Minnesota one as well. But it was really, really important because I truly believe to respect the rivalry, you got to do a lot of work, and you got to understand when you're walking into something, the history behind it and the meaning behind it, and what what's going to be a little bit different in those games. So I'm excited. Obviously, I've played Iowa a lot and coached against Iowa a lot, and I think every single game that I've ever coached in, maybe one that I played in, but ended up being a complete battle as well, has been just that. Kind of the history and the tradition of the type of ball they play and what it comes down to. So excited for that, excited for our guys, and obviously for our first real kind of rivalry game this year.
Look, when you look at Iowa, one of the guys I'm sure that stands out is Cooper DeJean. I'm just curious, how does he affect the game both as a cornerback and also on special teams?
Well, obviously, he does a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him on offense. I think later in the year, maybe last year, that there were some situations where all of a sudden he showed up on offense as well. He's a guy that you got to take be careful on. If you take shots on him and things like that, I mean, he can change a game. Obviously, he did it in the bowl game. I think he is the sole benefactor for that game being the way it was. I mean, he at least created a lot of those things. And then special teams, obviously, he can make some big plays. So definitely got to know where he is, got to definitely understand in some of those situations that they're going to find ways to use him, whether that's, singling him up defensively, whether it's in special teams or even if he does slide over, trying to find ways to get him on the offense. But a very dynamic player that even the last couple of years, not being in the league, I had seen and watched and heard a lot about.
Luke, a lot's been made of this Iowa offense, on a national scale, and they're very unique. I believe only 3 wide receivers have caught a pass for them. Just what's it like preparing for this Iowa offense this week?
Well, I mean, that's great for people to talk about and for, but it doesn't mean you can negate, preparing for things that might happen. Again, you might see somebody else out there at wide receiver and some different things. I think the media makes it a little bit more than what it is. I think the uniqueness is Iowa is still who Iowa is, and they're very good at running the football. They're very good at, disguising things. And, again, if you look at them, their big plays have been made more by the tight ends and Eric Hall and Lachey, who obviously is no longer in there, and their ability to pound the football. In some ways that they're getting back a little bit more, I think, the last few weeks to being who Iowa has been and what has made them really good. So we've seen that. We watch the same films, but I don't think that you can lull yourself to sleep and not think that there's going to be shots and there's going to be opportunities, and you're going to have to play well on the outside in a lot of those situations too.
Luke, there was a lot of off-season discussion about the changes that were being made offensively at Wisconsin, but from a defensive standpoint, how substantial do you think the changes have been? And now that you're 5 games in, what do you think some of the biggest challenges have been in trying to implement things and have the guys adjust to the scheme?
Well, you have a vision of what it is, and we did it a little bit in spring ball, and we did it in fall camp, and we knew that we were going to have to see how that thing was going to continue to evolve, and that's what in order to play your best ball at the end of the year, you got to be consistent, and sometimes going into the year, you know what you want to be, and then you recognize things that you have to do different. It's not that we can't continue to be consistent. We were, a little bit of a mixture going into the beginning of the season, from some 3 down and some 4 down, and I think we just have kind of fallen into a little bit more of, hey, what can our guys do? What do they fit best with? And we still got a mixture, but I think that we've had to evolve even more so defensively than we did offensively. And I know everybody talks about the offense and the changes and things like that. I think for us defensively, we've had to, in the first 5 weeks, really kind of get a hone in on the things that we believe we can continue to do and do well and get better at as we move down the stretch. And I think it's still a balance. It's just kind of the same thing on offense. It's still the ability to play with the 4 down and the 3 down and some of those things. But it's still about getting the right people on the field. And that's where I think I give none of the defensive guys some credit. They've had to evolve a little bit more even from the beginning of the season.
Luke, I know you weren't here when he was here, but Deacon Hill, Iowa's quarterback, was here for a few years. When you have a situation like that, can you mine information from your guys on defense over here, or do you just got to look at what he's doing at Iowa right now?
I think you just got to really take a good look at what he's doing there. I mean, there's not a whole lot here other than the players. Obviously, they know who he is and know a lot more about him and probably are still connected to him and friends. But it's hard to get into all that. I think you just got to make sure you do your job and evaluate what it is that they've done and see how they're using him in different ways. And that's where I think they've evolved a little bit. They talk about it with the wide receivers, but I think all the transition that they've had this year and some of the injuries has, kind of put them in a situation where they've got to do what they need to do to be successful and win. And obviously he's going to be the best opportunity for him at quarterback. And I don't know anything more than, obviously what I've seen in the last game and a half from him.
We're just doing a story on the Big Ten teams that are going through the season with interim head coaches and the obstacles involved in that deal. I'm just wondering, from your experience, from what you went through at Ohio State, what were the biggest challenges involved in getting through just the grind of the season? Particularly, I mentioned the first few weeks you have that we're all we got mentality, and that might wear off.
Yeah.
And what advice would you give?
I mean, we could talk for hours and hours and hours on that stuff. It's a unique situation. I think every situation is a little bit different, and to me, the thing I got as much out of it from my experience was, ultimately, if you're in charge, you got to be who you are. And sometimes you might not feel like that's the best situation for everybody around, but ultimately, whether it's, a whole season, whether it's 8, 9 weeks, whatever it was, ours was, an entire season, a 9-month period or 8-month period. It's really difficult to be consistent if you don't be who you are. And so I think that there's a lot of things, the dynamics of, a staff, not just the players. I think people think about the players as much as anything. And I think the uniqueness in a lot of those things, it's more about the staff, because it's a tough situation. There's a lot of things that guys don't know what the futures look like. And in order to get the 18 to 22-year-olds on the same path and the same page, you've got to have all those guys around you on the same path and the same page. And so there's a lot of things that, probably are as much and as important off the field as they are as on the field.
Did not anticipate you talking so much about the rivalry in the opening statement, so thanks for getting that out of the way. But I have a 2-part follow-up. What did you learn about this rivalry? And then, if I remember correctly, you were a little bit indifferent towards the protected rivalries, and maybe that was just because you said that you guys didn't really get a big say in it. But do you like the fact that Minnesota and Iowa are going to continue to be a thing going forward?
I do. Like I said, I'm a traditionalist. I think that what I don't think is always the best is, some have protected rivalries, some don't. How do they do that? How do they figure in? I mean, again, everybody's trying to jockey for what's best for them and their program. And so I think in some ways that makes it difficult. I think that, we don't want to be, talking out both sides of our mouth, right? I mean, we're adding 4 or so new teams, and we want to say we're traditionalists with the Big Ten, and we want to hold true to some of those things, but yet in the big picture of things, we aren't. So I think it's hard to say, whether we want to do this or we don't want to do this. I know they can say they're going to take the opinions of the coaches. I don't know that anybody asked us on opinions on guys coming into the league. So I don't know that they're going to really kind of say, okay, well, how important is it to this coach to have his protected rivalries. I think it's great for college football. No matter what the situation, no matter what our leagues continue to grow and change, our ability to still create great rivalries in college football, I think, is what makes this special. And so some way, somehow, we've got to, whether that's calling protected rivalries or not, it's just we've got to make sure we find ways to continue to keep, not just for the fans, but for the players and for the programs, these things intact, some way, somehow.
And what, if anything, you learned from? I know I gave you a two-parter there, but
Well,
did you learn anything in particular?
I don't know that obviously the trophy is only, I don't know how many years old. The rivalry is obviously a lot deeper. They come up with a trophy just to, I think in today's day and age in the world, and I don't know, but I hear it's really, really heavy. And so I just, I don't know a ton more about it truly than that, other than it's the closest team that we've got on our schedule. So I think proximity, we've got enough kids from the state, that I think, to me, that just kind of makes some things a little bit special. I've known a lot about Iowa. I want to say it. I'm not saying I grew up an Iowa fan, but in some ways it was one of my kind of spots because of wrestling that I knew a lot more about the University of Iowa and maybe their wrestling program than I did about their football program. But I always, kind of admired and probably was one of my first visits, not true visits like as a player, but to go to the university and watch a NCAA wrestling tournament when I was in like 7th or 8th grade. And so I've known a lot about the university, and I've studied their football programs, in particular their defense, as I was a young coach for the first 4 or 5, 6 years. So I know more about the University of Iowa than maybe to say you really know the history of the rivalry. I've studied that, but only for 8 months now, and the other things I've studied for quite a while.
Coach, Jonas DeClone has worked his way into the 2 deep, and I guess I'm just wondering what's kind of stood out to you about his journey, his development to get to this point.
Well, Jonas is one of those guys I've known for a long time. And obviously he's a true freshman this year, came in the spring, got a lot of work through spring football, got his first real probably, opportunity to play this weekend, and, made some plays. And I don't want to say that he didn't, but, the last play of defense obviously is one that kind of stands out. But Jonas has got a bright future. It was a situation where, he didn't have to be in there, but I think that the experience that he got even this past weekend in a game that was, still a game, and guys that were still taking shots, is going to vote really well for him and for us in the future, whether that's in the next 6-8 weeks or if that doesn't happen to be as much this year as next. But definitely a guy that has got a bright future, and I feel like if we need him, he's got some experience now, and we wouldn't hesitate to put him in the game.
Kind of a follow-up on DeJean as a punt returner. Has Atticus shown you this year the ability to perhaps negate a really good punt returner with what he can do, where he can place the ball?
Well, I hope the combination of him, as well as, systematically how we can try not to punt the ball 60 yards and give guys opportunities to return. We would much prefer, 45 yards and a 4.5-second hang time, so that hopefully we can cause a lot of fair catches. But it's going to be a challenge. Last week I thought the challenge was, for our punt team in particular, was being sound in what we were doing, because they were going to bring 8 guys. They were going to find some way to scheme up, to overload you. This week it's similar. I mean, they're going to find ways to pressure your punter so that so that they have more opportunities maybe to get in his hands and create some things in return game. So nonetheless, that's where I think that if Iowa, they'll do a great job at some way, somehow, making you have to try to play to their strengths.
Luke, getting the ball deep in the passing game has been a little bit of a struggle. I know you've had some drops in that particular area, but is there something that you feel like defenses are doing as a whole that's making that tough, or is it just kind of some execution on your end?
I think it's a combination. I think that we'd all say that we would like to take some more of those shots, and you can't make plays down the field if you don't eventually take some of those shots. But I think that's where the maturity of our quarterback has shown. There's enough of them that are called, but when they're not there, he's been really smart and not just saying, hey, I'm going to throw this thing up and see if it is a 50-50 ball. And has the ability to move on and progress through whatever it is he has to, and if he has to pull it down and create some things with his legs, he has to. So I think it's twofold. I think guys have done a good job at staying on top of those guys, recognizing some of the shot situations and maybe playing a little bit more coverage. But then I think it's twofold on our part too. I think our quarterback has done a really, really good job at recognizing, maybe when it's not there, as opposed to if he was younger, if he was kind of turned loose, that he would say, hey, anytime we call one of those things, I'm just going to launch this thing up. And so I think it's a little bit of twofold. In some ways, maybe you want him to take some of those shots, but he's been really, really efficient and smart with the ball. And I think that in the long run, that's what's best for us.
Luke, you guys have obviously been rolling Michael Furtney and Trey Way to get that guard spot. How have you seen both of those players kind of handle that situation, and is that something we can expect to see for the foreseeable future?
Actually, all three of those guys roll. I think that we want pretty much to come out at the end of a game and have equal time between Trey, Joe Huber, and Michael Furtney. And that's kind of been the MO of the last couple weeks. I think we've been on pace with that. Sometimes it gets a little bit off based on a longer series, this, that, or the other thing, but Michael and Joe Huber have been starters, and Trey's been the first guy rotating, I think, in the first three series. Those guys have handled it great. I think that it gives us some flexibility. Trey's still a guy that pops out a tackle if we need to as well. So we feel like we've got for sure 6 starters up front, and hopefully these next few weeks, we don't need more than 6 starters, but we know that Jake Renfro and some of those guys are working their way back into those situations where we feel like if we need to, we hopefully can have 7 or 8.
You talked about how you studied Iowa and their history and stuff. I'm just wondering, from an outsider's perspective, from your perspective, why do they play great defense year in, year out, and what's the common element that their best defense is?
They're physical, they're tough, and they're very consistent. And that's not to say they don't have some great players as well. But I think if you just ask me over time of everything that I've watched and studied and learned about Iowa, it starts with they're physical and tough. And then the consistency thing, that in order for anybody to be good at what they're doing, they've got to have some consistency. And whether that's over the last 15 years or the last year or two, whether it was Phil Parker or Norm Parker, there has been an incredible amount of consistency. And obviously you can credit that to Coach Ferentz, even though he's more of an offensive side guy, but he understands that, what gives them sometimes the greatest chance to be successful is the way they play defensively.
Luke, obviously a lot's been made of the Iowa offense, but they're still winning games, and they're right there in the Big Ten West race. Is there a unique challenge in facing a team that is winning games but doing it in kind of a different way than most teams do it? Well,
they're doing it in the way that which Iowa does it. So I think that's what's, we get caught up into what everybody else wants, and they've talked about that, whether it's, hey, this is what you got to have this many points in order to have this. The reality is there's only one stat that matters, and it's wins. And, we always can find stats that, make us feel good. We can always find stats that, that make you not feel good and you got to get better at. But I think the great thing that they've got is they've got consistency. They've got confidence in what it is that they do, and that starts at the top. Coach Ferentz isn't going to say let's conform to what somebody else wants us to do and what might be, so to speak, more fun, because fun is winning. And if you can find ways to win, you have a lot more fun in doing it. So I don't get into it as much. To be quite honest with you, I think that there's nobody that's done a better job at being who they are and finding ways to win and knowing, what you need to do to win. I think last week, we faced a team that is really good at doing what they do and finding ways to give them a chance to win. And this week we're playing one that's does an even better job of that.
Luke, your kickoff unit has had 4 kickoffs now go out of bounds for penalties. What if anything, do you do to change that? Do you feel like you have to make a change, or is it just changing what's expected on the kick?
It's consistency. It's a pretty good unit, to be honest with you. When they do return it, we can't. Obviously, we can't kick the ball out of bounds. That's just that. If you would say, what's the one thing special teams wise that you probably haven't done a good enough job on it? Obviously, it's kick placement on the kickoff, and so we got to continue to find ways to get better at that. We've got some other guys that can do it. If Jack can't get it done, he can, and I think it's It's just confidence, consistency, and you get in our stadium and the wind starts to swirl a little bit, and sometimes that can get into their heads or his head, especially when maybe he hasn't kicked it as well as he would like. But I think it comes down to us being more consistent in what we're doing, trusting what we're doing, and making guys, if they want it, they got to return it. They got to return it. I mean, we've got guys on there. We put players on there. They got a job to do as well. But deep down, we got to be more consistent.
Luke, kind of a recruiting question for you. When you're looking at the offensive line, do you look for guys that have played center, or do you just look for linemen that you can develop into a center? Because it seems like the spot that's maybe the hardest to project and develop at the college level.
It is. You'd have to. I mean, twofold to me. I think it's definitely something you can learn. But walking in the door, if they've played center, that's a really good thing. But to be honest with you, in high school, I don't know that you're always going to put your best guy at center. Based on what you do, they moved me to center, so maybe some people do put their best guy at center. That obviously wasn't the case for us in high school either. But I think it is unique. I think that if you haven't done it, I think there's some things that obviously as you get into it make it more difficult. Obviously defenses and how they play can make it more difficult. Usually the head-up nose creates some, a little bit more of an issue for our centers. And for centers in particular, but it's one of those skills that you can snap as many times as you want after practice and before practice and things like that. But it's definitely different when the lights come on in the midst of that game with all the things that a center has to do, from making calls, IDing protections, and things like that. There's a lot more on the plate that anybody probably knows. Everybody thinks it's all on the quarterback, and I think the next guy that has as much on his plate as anybody is a center.